top 10 list that I am going to do on this channel, I want to talk about my disappointments of 2021 and my surprises of 2021. There is going to be the new top 10 end of year list that I'm going to do. Hopefully you guys enjoyed my top 10 best movies of 2021 and my top 10 worst movies of 2021. Hopefully you enjoy those videos. Now, we're going to get into some more interesting stuff. So for this list, I want to talk about my top 10 most disappointing movies that I have seen in 2021. Now here is the thing. None of these movies are awful movies. None of these movies are bad movies. These are just the movies that I was excited for going in, but they didn't turn out as it seems. There are some fine movies on this list. There are some movies I did enjoy on this list, but most of these movies on this list are movies that I'm like, okay, I wanted more. I like what it's given me. Some of them I don't like as much, but I wanted more than I was anticipating. So there's no honorable mentions because it's not like my best and worst list, you know, they're big movies or anything. These are just 10 disappointing movies, and I'm going to do the same thing with the surprising movies of 2021, which that is coming up next. So these are my top 10 movies that could have been so much better than they actually are. I would say they're the mostly okay movies of 2021, but I want to call them my top 10 disappointing movies of 2021. So here it is, my top 10 most disappointing movies of 2021. So let's start off this list with number 10. So I want to start off with my number 10 with The Little Things. Now, the director of this movie, he directed The Blind Side. I really love that movie. And this film has a very killer cast. I love Denzel Washington, Rami Malek, Jared Leto. Like, what a cast for this movie. And the trailers of this movie looks like a very interesting thriller. And this movie, probably one of my biggest issues with the film is the first act. It's very, very slow to get to where the movie is going. And then when the third act comes in, or second to third act, that's when the movie got going. And that's very disappointing because the setup of a movie should intrigue you. But to me, it just felt so slow. Like, it talks more about Denzel Washington, and I felt like they could focus on other characters as well. I still enjoy The Little Things as a very simple, like, Seven type thriller, you know what I mean? Like, it felt like a David Fincher film. It looks like the director of the movie is very inspired by David Fincher's work, and I like that. But the movie felt so slow to get to basically the main part of this movie, and that's why I want to put The Little Things in my disappointing films. But I still enjoyed the film nonetheless. 9. Coming into my number 9 is Chaos Walking. Now I know a lot of people really do hate this film. I don't personally hate this film as much as everyone else because I find the concept of Chaos Walking very, very interesting. When I saw the trailer of the film, I'm like, okay, this could be a very interesting film. And another film with a killer cast with Daisy Ridley, Tom Holland, Mads Mikkelsen. Just what a cast for this film. I think one of my biggest issues with Chaos Walking is that the execution of the story was mostly pretty bland. I think the performances are fine in this film from Tom Holland, even Daisy Ridley. But the problem with this movie is that you can really realize the production issues that this movie's got. This movie has been scheduled so many times, and some people say it's one of the most unreleasable movies of the year. And I can understand that. You can really tell that this movie has a lot of production issues. But definitely this is a movie I wanted more because the concept of this film was very, very interesting, and I feel very bad for Doug Liman. This is a bad year for him with Lockdown and this movie. I really feel bad. The movie was just a pretty bland science fiction film, and it's a film that I definitely wanted more, especially when it comes to this concept alone. Coming into my number 8 is Army of the Dead. Now, I don't hate this movie. A lot of people thinking I hate this film. I really don't. I think this is a fun, entertaining movie nonetheless. But after Zack Snyder's Justice League, I wanted more from this movie. I thought Zack Snyder is basically back on his tropes for great movie making, and this movie looks great. I think the zombies look really, really cool. Dave Bautista, the rest of the cast did their good job, but this movie has a lot of dumb stuff where I'm like, Zack Snyder should be smarter than this making this movie. I think this movie has some of the best opening credit scenes I've ever seen in a film. Like, the opening credits is really good. The action was mostly very good. It's entertaining enough for a film like this. But it's definitely a movie I wanted more from its plot and its execution. Especially after Justice League, I was expecting this film to be as great as I thought, but that teaches me to not get your expectations too high, or else I'll be let down from this movie. And that's the bright example, Army of the Dead for me. 7. Coming into my number 7 is Reminiscence. Now, I think this is a year for concepts, you know, the concepts of this year. They're trying to be original again, and I get that. For Reminiscence, I was mostly disappointed the way the plot is handled because this movie just turns into a very bland mystery film that I feel like the concept alone just felt like its own thing. I think the performances are great, especially Hugh Jackman. Like, this is a good return for Hugh Jackman because he hasn't been in a film probably since The Greatest Showman and Bad Education. So he's a great actor. I love Hugh Jackman. He's a guy that inspires me to become an actor because, you know, he's the first actor that I discovered. But this movie, it just felt kind of boring and bland, and I felt like this movie could have been so much more interesting than it is. I think the look of this movie looks cool. I love the whole concept, and I can see what the movie is trying to do. Like, I can see what Lisa Joy is trying to do with this film, but I felt like Reminiscence is just mostly a very bland murder mystery film that could have been so much better with its execution, especially the location of the film has taken place. Coming into my number 6 is the Tomorrow War. Now, a concept alone of people teleporting from the future, grabbing soldiers to fight aliens, that's a cool concept alone. This could be like the next Terminator, you know? Like, I like this plot. It looks very, very cool. The trailers look very promising. I did enjoy this film for what it was, but I think the concept was much better in this film than its execution. I just find this movie very bland and fine in a way. I think Chris Pratt is the one that saved this movie. I think he was really good in the film. But like a concept like this where the aliens look really cool and like humans from the present are fighting these creatures, it should be awesome. It should be a great science fiction action film. It could be the next Aliens, you know what I mean? But the film just turns into a generic Skydance film that has some pretty cool action scenes, but that's all there is. There's nothing too special about what the Tomorrow will present us, and that's pretty disappointing, the way the film is presented. Up to the top 5. None of these movies are terrible, like I said. Most of these movies are just movies that I wanted more for in 2021, and that's why I was very disappointed in those movies. Coming into my number 5 is Don't Breathe 2. I love the first Don't Breathe. I think it's one of the most intense films that I've seen in the last decade. I think the film has no protagonists, basically. They're both antagonists in a way, and that's what I liked about the film. You don't know who to root for. Don't Breathe 2, you have someone to root for, the blind man, which is very confusing because he was the antagonist in the first Don't Breathe, and in this movie, they made him the good guy, which I don't think it works. I think this film is entertaining enough, like the house invasion elements, the violence, it's still there. It has its fun that it needs to be, but for a sequel, it could have pitched up, it could have been much better than the first one. But after this movie, I'm just like, I feel like the first Don't Breathe could have stand on its own in my personal opinion. But Stephen Lang is still great in the film. There are some good action scenes. It is suspenseful at parts, but just from the concept alone of the blind man being the protagonist, it really ruins what Don't Breathe is mostly about, in my opinion. Coming into my number 4 is definitely one of the most disappointing comedies of the year, and that is Coming to America. I love the first Coming to America. I think First Coming to America is honestly one of my favorite comedies of all time. Eddie Murphy is one of my favorite comedians of all time. I love the first Coming to America, so when I heard that they're going to make a sequel, I'm interested, because obviously we haven't seen Eddie Murphy in a comedy film in a long, long time, and I think that is the best part about the film. Eddie Murphy, he still has the exact same charm, and even Arsenio Hall. They have still a great chemistry, and I think Wesley Snipes made this movie at least fine, because he actually was very funny in the film. But yeah, the problem with this movie is that this film doesn't need to be needed. And the film does show us that. It goes for that lazy plot where Akeem has a son. It's for every comedy that came out like 30 years later. It's always something about son, because that's the only thing they can do with sequels, which just makes it so unnecessary. But it's not a terrible movie by any means. There are some likabilities with this film. I think the location where they filmed this movie in is beautiful. Like, I love the Kingdom of Zamunda. I think the look of Zamunda looks really amazing in this film. It's good to look at, but the comedy, there are parts where I did chuckle, especially with the barber guys coming back, but they were only in the movie for one scene, and the rest of the movie is just a pretty bland and generic comedy that follows the exact same tropes and nostalgia than most 30 years later sequels coming out. Coming to my number 3 is one disappointing horror film. I have another one in my number 2, but this is another disappointing horror film because I think horror films haven't been the best this year. The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Now, coming from the guy that adores the first Conjuring films, I was honestly really excited to see what the director of The Curse of La Llorona is going to bring us for The Conjuring 3, because, yeah, he did The Curse of La Llorona, that movie sucks, but he could improve. Directors can improve, but this movie just turns into another bland horror film that follows the exact same tropes that I had with The Curse of La Llorona. This movie wasn't scary, which is so disappointing because the first two Conjuring films are terrifying. I honestly love The Conjuring 2 more than the first one because I thought that movie is terrifying. This movie, it wasn't terrifying at all. There's not one single scare that made me jump, basically. The thing that definitely saved this movie, that I did save it from the worst list, is Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga's chemistry as the Warrens. It's still there, you still love them too, you follow them throughout the movie, it is fine enough. But I just think its execution and the horror aspects and the story, it could have been much better, especially that the plot of this movie is actually really, really dark. But the movie just make it into a pretty bland and generic horror film, and honestly, I think the director of this movie, this is the wrong director to do a Conjuring movie. Just bring James Wan back. But he did Malignant, and that movie was also really, really good. Now, definitely this is the most disappointing horror film of the entire year. I think this movie has a lot of potential with its concept, but this movie just felt very, very flat, and that is Halloween Kills. I grew up with the Halloween movies. I did like the 2018's Halloween movie, so the continuation of that, I'm interested already. And then the movie just turns out as a pretty dumb horror film where they made Laurie Strode basically out of the movie. Like, she was in the hospital throughout most of the movie. The film just focuses on the town going up against Michael Myers, which I find that actually pretty interesting if the characters are interesting. And now the characters I was honestly interested in. I think the best part about this movie, and the thing that definitely saved this movie that I didn't put in my worst list, is Michael Myers himself. When he kills people, it's very freaking entertaining to watch. I think there are some good violence in the film. This is the most brutal that I've seen in all the Halloween movies. It's brutal. And I think the kills in the movie, they did a lot of that in the film. And that would make me think, okay, at least I can enjoy the film for that. But the story, its execution, the characters, they make really dumb decisions in the film, especially towards the end. It turns out to be one of the most disappointing horror films that I have seen this entire year. Now, my number one, this is definitely the most disappointing film that I have seen in 2021. This is a film that I was actually very excited for the very beginning. We're finally getting this movie. And the movie just turns out as one of the most bland and generic comic book films that I've seen all year. This is definitely one of the most disappointing comic book films of the year, and that is Black Widow. We're finally getting a Black Widow movie. We're finally getting a Black Widow movie. Ever since probably Iron Man 2, we wanted a Black Widow movie. And Marvel's like, we're not ready for that. And now after Avengers Endgame, when, spoiler alert, Black Widow dies, we got basically a Black Widow movie. And this movie is a bright example of years too late. Because this movie honestly was first very bland, very generic. I do like the family though. I think David Harbour was great. Florence Pugh in the film though is fantastic. She is the savior of this movie. I was planning to put Black Widow on my worst list because of how much of a letdown this film was. But if it wasn't for Florence Pugh, my god, this movie would have been terrible. It has some good action scenes, but there are a lot of moments in the film where I'm like, seriously, Black Widow survived this? It's really messed up, and that's really, really weird. It just turns into a pretty generic MCU film that I honestly would forget. Kind of like with Captain Marvel. And that's very disappointing because Natasha Romanoff is a really interesting character in the MCU. And getting her a movie, that's like a treat for us. And now we got this movie that could have so much potential. We could have experienced more of her origin story, to be honest. But no, we get as a generic MCU film that took place after Civil War. For some reason, it really was messed up. And the villain Taskmaster was probably one of the worst villains of the year because honestly, this villain really is not cool. And that's disappointing because Taskmaster in the comics is cool. He can mimic every move that the hero has. That's awesome. In this movie, they make him pretty bland. Or her, because it actually is a her, spoiler alert. It made it bland. Black Widow is definitely a movie that let me down this year. It's probably the biggest blockbuster that came out this year. And it really, really blew it. So guys, that is my top 10 most disappointing movies that I have seen in 2021. Look forward to my very last end of year top 10 list, which is my top 10 movies that surprised me in 2021. Look forward to that. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know down below what are your top 10 most disappointing films of the year, or top 5 if you couldn't make a top 10. Let me know down in the comments below which movie that disappointed you the most. Make sure you guys follow me on social media links down below. Facebook, Stardust, Instagram, Twitter, and Letterboxd. Keep contacting with me. And make sure you guys subscribe to my channel notified for my latest movie reviews and other movie related content. And have a nice day.